Prince Andrew Romanov, who is a descendant of the Romanov family, the royal family that Lenin, of course, had killed. So why a descendant of the Romanovs would feel a desire to paint Vladimir Lenin, I don't know, but I have that image in my office now. So just explaining where that comes from a little bit there. So if you want to look at something, look at that and reflect on Lenin. Anyway, so turning then to the topic of the day, and I'm actually not going to turn to the topic of the day, the topic being Russia and debates about Russian history and Russian identity. I'm going to direct our attention first to our own country, to the US, and say something about the US before transitioning over to a look at Russia and considering some reflections on Russia. So what I want to direct our attention to is 2019 in the US. 2019 and the publication in the New York Times of a collection of essays by Nikole Hannah-Jones. And this collection of essays that I'm talking about is, of course, the 1619 Project. So 2019, publication of the 1619 Project, and then a couple of years later, publication of the 1619 Project as a book. And what is going on with the 1619 Project? The argument from Nikole Hannah-Jones is that the true founding of the United States, the true starting point of the United States is 1619 with the arrival of the first African slaves into Virginia. That is the start of the US, not the Declaration of Independence in 1776, not the signing of the Constitution in 1789, but 1619 and slavery. Okay, so the 1619 Project, of course, is a bestseller, but a bestseller that doesn't go without controversy and criticism. Some of that criticism comes from historians who have quibbles with some of the information presented by Hannah-Jones, Hannah-Jones being a journalist, not a historian herself. And she has to do a little bit of backtracking there and, says some of what she initially said was for dramatic effect and wasn't meant to be taken as literal history, whatever. So there is some pushback from historians. There's also pushback against the 1619 Project from politicians of various stripes, including pushback from Donald Trump. And some of that pushback from Trump was to create what he called a 1776 commission on so-called patriotic education or the teaching of history. Notably, on Trump's own 1776 commission, there were no academic historians on that commission, and the commission itself went kind of nowhere. Today, we are still seeing some debates about how race should and shouldn't be talked about in school, and that includes debates on critical race theory, and some of that criticism comes from people who do understand what critical race theory is, and some of that criticism just coming from Republican politicians, especially, who have caught on to that phrase as a buzzword and maybe don't actually know what it is, but they know they don't want it taught. And one of those critics of critical race theory is Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, who has banned the teaching of critical race theory in Florida. Okay, we have seen in the US recently battles over the telling of history in other ways too, on what to do with monuments, for instance. So Confederate monuments? What do we do with those? What do we do with statues to Confederate soldiers in the South? Or even what to do with memorials to the founding fathers themselves? What do you do with monuments to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, both who owned slaves? Is it right to continue to memorialize these former presidents here? What about other prominent figures? Princeton University's School of Public Policy was named after Woodrow Wilson, who served as president of Princeton University, was governor of New Jersey, and then, of course, president of the United States, but also held racist views. Well, the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy was renamed after the 2020 George Floyd protests there because of Wilson's view. So even though Wilson has these long-standing connections with Princeton itself and with New Jersey, and went on to be president of the United States, his name is no longer associated with the public policy school at Princeton. So why are these wars about history so heated? Because it's not just about history. It's about identity as well. It's about values. It's about what the United States stands for. It's what it means to be an American. So there had been some popular consensus about the telling of American origins, from Columbus to the Mayflower and the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving, to the founding. The founding being a good thing, and about the founders themselves. Stories about George Washington. He could not tell a lie. When he chopped down his father's cherry tree. Those sorts of myths were part of the telling of American history. That sort of consensus is gone. Turning attention to Ohio itself, the removing of the statue of Columbus from Columbus, Ohio, and now the celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day. Okay, so these debates have been kind of raging in public consciousness for the past few years, and it's not my intent to settle these debates. I think some people have too rosy a view of the United States and aren't willing to admit any faults with the U.S. And then I'd say other people, have too negative a view of the United States and see only the warts of the U.S. Point is, we've got this big debate about history and identity that's pretty heated in our own country. Imagine having that debate about history and identity not over 3 years, it's been 3 years since the publication of the 1619 Project. Imagine having that debate consistently over 3 centuries instead of 3 years. Well, that's essentially what you've got going on in Russia, a debate about Russian identity and Russian history that really has its beginnings in earnest with the rule of Peter the Great in the early 1700s. Okay. Before talking about the significance of Peter, some history of what we're looking at pre-Peter, so before the early 1700s here. If we look to the western part of Europe, we can think of any number of things that are linking the peoples, the populations of Western Europe. So we have, in the ancient period, we have the Roman Empire, which stretches from Rome itself to modern day Britain. So we've got that huge territory covered by Rome and the unity that Roman law brings. After the end of the Roman Empire, you still have the the legacy of Rome, including the use of the Latin language, or when vernacular languages start to be used, you still have the Latin alphabet being used. And then you have later in the medieval period, you have Catholicism binding Western Europe. And after that, you have the Protestant Reformation as something that's affecting Western Europe. So the Protestant Catholic battles there. All these movements, all these ties uniting the peoples of the West. They're a common experience in Western Europe. There's also, on top of this, common philosophical literary traditions. And so I'm going to give you a name here who you've likely never heard of and likely won't hear again. Grigory Skovoroda. Yeah, exactly. That your reaction, there's no loud, you're muted, but I'm guessing there's not a loud applause for Grigory Skovoroda. Grigory Skovoroda lived 1722 to 1794. So the 18th century, and his nickname was the Russian Socrates. So the Russian Socrates lives and writes in the 1700s. Meanwhile, when does Socrates, that Greek philosopher, live? Socrates lives 469 BC to 399 BC. So quite a few centuries before there is a Russian Socrates, there's philosophy in Greece. And then there's a whole tradition of philosophical thought after Socrates in the Western part of Europe. So you've got Plato, you've got Aristotle, and then you've got the major Catholic thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas, and then some secular thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. All of those people are the heritage of the West. Meanwhile, Russia is not taking part in that heritage there. This common philosophical, literary, scientific tradition that's binding Western Europe, Russia is outside of that. Russia is its own separate entity doing its own thing. Part of that is simply geographical. So if we consider the distance between Paris and London, that's 280 miles. If we're talking London to Rome, that's 1,100 miles. Meanwhile, Paris to Moscow is 1,750 miles. London to Moscow, 1,780 miles. Rome to Moscow, 1,900 miles. So if Russia is separate from Western Europe, that has in large part to do with just geography there, the fact that Russia and its capital is very much distant from the rest of Europe. So the solution for Peter the Great, now coming to Peter, if you want to be closer to Europe, if you want to keep an eye on what's going on in the West, move closer to the West. And that's what he does. So Peter the Great, Peter founds a new capital for Russia, moves the capital away from Moscow. So Moscow had been the capital from the early 1300s until 1720 or so, when Peter founds a new city, and that's St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg is geographically closer to Western Europe, and it's also a port city. And that means being on the port, being right on the ocean there, makes exploration, engagement, trade, reception with the West much easier there. And Peter the Great planned St. Petersburg as his, what he called the window on the West. That was going to be his area to be able to better take stock of what's going on in Western Europe. Okay. So Peter the Great's changes don't involve nearly moving the capital of Russia from Moscow to this new city of St. Petersburg. He's also engaged in a bunch of reforms. He strengthens the Russian military. He reduces the powers of the Russian Orthodox Church. He introduces, after his own travels through Western Europe, Western styles into Russia. Western styles of dress, Western styles of doing business, Western political ideas as well. So that includes things like bureaucratic organization that he's seen in the West. So the way, we think of our military today, where you've got your generals and your colonels, and I don't know the rankings for military there, and your sergeants on down there. Peter sees that in Western militaries, and he also sees that there's a hierarchy in civil service there. So there are clerks, and then there's people at another upper level who are the assistant whatever, and then there's the whatever. So there's a hierarchy there. He introduces that sort of bureaucracy, which hadn't existed in Russia as well. Okay. So he's doing this sort of thing, and he's followed one of his successors. Catherine the Great continues on trying to introduce Western European ideas and policies into Russia. So Catherine rules from 1762 to 1796. So if Peter is the early part of the 1700s, Catherine is the later part. So we have the whole run of the 18th century of Russian emperors trying to emulate the West and introduce Western ideas into Russia. And that includes some political ideas. So in the Western world, we start to see some philosophical discussion of notions like freedom and equality and educational reform. Well, Catherine introduces some of that language and some of those policies there until there is the French Revolution. And when she sees, all right, if this talk of freedom and equality is going to end up with the monarchs losing their heads, we can stop that talk of freedom and equality now. But there is this period where she is bringing Western thinkers into St. Petersburg, to talk with them, introducing their works to educated literary Russian society. And then again, there's kind of a pause when she has to consider where those ideas are leading, and she's not interested in losing her own head there. Okay, so that's the 18th century. That's Peter, that's Catherine. Peter is recognized as the great in the 19th century. That is not to say he's recognized as Peter the Good. And what I mean by that is Peter the Great, he's great in the sense of being significant. There's debate about whether Peter is good in terms of whether the significant things that he achieved are things he ought to have achieved for Russia. So there was debate in the 19th century about whether the policies that Peter introduced and that were followed by Catherine were good things there. So the debate becomes what it is that Russia should be doing. Is Russia meant just to emulate Western Europe, in which case it's always going to be a step or two behind? Western Europe will do its things, and then Russia copies. That's one thing, that's one side. Or is there something unique about Russia? Is there something that Russia can contribute to the world? So that's the major debate that emerges in the 19th century between the so-called Westernizers and the Slavophiles. The Westernizers are those who want Russia to be more like the West and push for more reform of Russian society along Western lines. The Slavophiles are the group of educated Russians, and this debate, I should note, it's in a relatively small segment or circle of Russian society. It's not like people on the streets are having these conversations, because in the 19th century, most Russians are illiterate and are focused purely on making it through the day. It's subsistence farming largely, but among the educated class, you've got those who want to keep doing what Peter had done and introduce more Western ideas. And then you've got those who say Peter was in the wrong. What Russia needs to do is be more authentically Russian. And maybe Europe can learn something from Russia. So what's good about Russia? The Orthodox Church. What Russian traditions does society have worth keeping? There were some peasant communes that were kind of unique to Russia, and those could be kept. But the Slavophiles, this group that's opposed to the Westernizers, they say there's a need to go back to how society looked before Peter's reforms. Okay. All right. Part of the problem that the Slavophiles, this group of thinkers who are more geared towards emphasizing Russia's uniqueness, part of the problem that they have with Peter and with St. Petersburg in particular is that it all seems artificial to them. And in a sense, St. Petersburg is artificial. St. Petersburg is a planned city. So it's been mapped out with streets that are parallel to each other, and it's been planned. We're going to have house, 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 here, here, here. And it's very structured and linear. And if you look at how St. Petersburg is built, Peter the Great purposefully modeled it on Western cities. So the palace that he builds in St. Petersburg is consciously modeled after Versailles in Versailles, around Paris there. So the palace of the French monarchs, Peter the Great wants one that looks pretty much like that. And he brings Italian architects into St. Petersburg, and he brings Italian materials into St. Petersburg. And essentially the palace that's created in St. Petersburg looks very much like Versailles there. So if you wanted to Google that right now, you would see. I mean, they're very difficult to tell apart if you're not familiar with what Versailles looks like and what Peterhof, the palace in St. Petersburg looks like. But it's the same gold, the same large windows, the same garden, very, very much duplicates of each other there. So Petersburg gets this reputation of being artificial, imitative, not authentically Russian. What's authentically Russian? Moscow, where instead of having these planned streets will curve. So if there's a need to build a new house because a family has grown, then you build a new house. And if there's another family that comes in, you tack on another house to the street, and the streets are kind of winding, and they're not parallel to each other. They're not just row after row after row that are consciously designed. It's more organic growth there. And Moscow is where you're going to see those onion-shaped domes on the Russian Orthodox churches and the bright colors and things like that. So the Slavophiles say that's what Russia is. That's what true Russia is. Okay. What Catherine and Peter also bring in is a division into society between the educated classes and the masses. So the educated classes and the masses in the 18th century and then into the 19th century, they speak to each other in Russia, and they write to each other in Russia, the educated classes, the literate part of society. They speak and write in either French or German. That's how much of the incorporation of the West is going on in Russia there. Bringing in West European languages, writing in German and French. Meanwhile, ordinary everyday Russians are, of course, speaking to each other in Russian. So that helps create a gulf between the educated classes and common people there. The fact that you've got the literate part of society speaking in the language of the West and doing Western things. Meanwhile, ordinary everyday Russians speak Russian. Okay. So that debate, I would say, in the 1830s becomes more extreme in the 1860s. So the 1830s, you have those who are more interested in Western reform and those who are more interested in Russia being authentically Russian, but they speak to each other. Those two camps are able to dialogue with one another. They're able to interact with one another. They go to each other's houses and convene with one another. By the 1860s, a radicalism has emerged such that the Westernizers can't talk with those who are more sympathetic to Russian native policies there. There's a split in the 1860s where instead of the Westernizers being reform-minded, they go down a path of radicalism and then revolutionary thought. Likewise, the Slavophiles who wanted to say that there was something good, something noble about Russia, and that certain Russian traits should be preserved, they too go in a more extreme direction in the 1860s. It's no longer for them enough to say Russia has good attributes and those should be preserved and protected against intrusion from the West. In the 1860s, those of a pro-Russian sympathy there become more extreme and say, Russia has some unique traits that are good and are good for the world and should be imposed on neighbors there. So both the Westernizers and the Slavophiles in the 1860s become more extreme and they can't talk to each other. Okay. Communist revolution in the early 20th century is a weird meld of these two strands of thinking that are going on. It welds Pan-Slav imperial ambitions, and it returns the capital to Moscow. But the communist revolution hasn't, and its supporters have no tolerance for the things that the earlier Slavophiles regarded as good. So orthodoxy, no, not going to hold on to that there. The czarist system, no, not going to hold on to that. The peasant agricultural system, no, that's not what the communists are interested in holding on to. And they're also opposed to the inherited literary and artistic traditions of Russia. So the communists, when they come to power in the early 20th century, they are very critical of, for instance, names like Dostoevsky and some of these big major figures of 19th century Russian literature there. So the communist revolution has, again, in common with the Pan-Slavs of the past, the imperial ambitions, but in common with the Westernizers there. They are importing Western ideas. They're importing Marxism from Germany. And that's what's going on in the early 20th century. So for 70 years in the 20th century, its political and economic system set Russia apart from the West. It was a unique system there. The communist political system and the communist economic system, that's different from the West. After its collapse, though, the question has risen again, what is it that Russia offers to the world? What parts of its history are worth celebrating and worth keeping? And what will its future be? And I think that question, that historical question of what is it that Russia stands for and what of Russia's history can be kept, is a debate that Vladimir Putin has waded right into and has his own position there. So one of the things that Putin does is every May there's a celebration of Victory Day in not only Moscow, but cities across Russia. Victory Day celebrating the Soviet Army's success in World War II and the defeat of the Nazis there. That is something that Putin wants to point to as a success and hold that legacy on for ordinary Russians to drum up as something noble that Russians contributed to. And in Putin's defense, that's not an exaggeration to say that the Soviet Army played a decisive role in World War II. Again, the Soviet Union was allied with the US in World War II. They were not our adversaries in World War II. They were our allies in World War II and played the instrumental role in defeating Hitler and the Nazis on the Eastern Front. And that was millions of Soviet troops that died there. Putin wants to drum up the recognition and the commemoration of that victory there, because it is something in Russia's past that he can point to as a success. That is a glue that can hold the Russian population together and say, remember when we did this? This was a noble endeavor. This was a goal that we as a nation, as a people, had in common. And we met that goal and we achieved victory. We met that outcome. What else, though, can Putin point to in Russian history, though? What is it that Russia's influence on the world has been? If we look to the West, we see the influence of the West around the world in all sorts of ways. The spread of English as the world language, or French, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, of course, that didn't come without cost. The cost of colonialism, very, very big there, obviously. But the influence of the West in the world, undeniable. And then the influence of democratic policies and institutions, the spread of those from Western Europe and the US to other parts of the world, that's a contribution. And the spread of capitalism there. It's easy to find ways in which the West is influencing the world. What are the ways in which Russia is influencing the world? I think that is something that Putin is looking for at the moment, something to inspire his population. Why now? Why is it so important now to find something to hold on to? And what is the role of the invasion of Ukraine in this? How does that fit into the picture here? Putin was initially popular because his regime stood in contrast to Boris Yeltsin's. So Boris Yeltsin's tenure as president of Russia marked by a lot of turbulence because it was a time of transition for Russia, away from the communist system to something new. Attempts at democracy, attempts at capitalism, and that transition was traumatic for a lot of people. It ended up with there being some haves and a lot of have-nots there. So there was a lot of poverty that came along with the transition away from communism in Russia. And there was a lot of instability. And Boris Yeltsin, of course, famously just his demeanor, you can look up videos of Boris Yeltsin drunk. You will find things there. Putin, by contrast, sober, stable. That's the sort of thing that he brought to Russia and made him popular initially. His popularity has dipped in recent years as the Yeltsin years fade into the background here. There isn't that stark contrast between Putin, the sober, stable, pragmatic leader, and Yeltsin, the wild card there. So if Putin doesn't have that contrast to buoy his popularity there, then what does he have? Economically, he doesn't have a lot to speak of there. His tenure hasn't been a great economic success for ordinary, everyday Russians. So Russia, if we're looking at GDP per capita, a measure of how wealthy a country is and how well off people, ordinary people in a country are doing, Russia among post-communist states is pretty much in the middle when it comes to GDP per capita. So places like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, GDP per capita is much higher than GDP per capita in Russia. Russia's doing better than places like Tajikistan or Uzbekistan, maybe, but it's not doing as well as other former members of the Soviet Union, to say nothing of the members of the communist bloc that weren't officially part of the Soviet Union, like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary there. So if people are not doing well economically in Russia, by and large, they're doing okay-ish, but that's it. What can Putin offer? Maybe rallying the troops behind some foreign policy achievement. And I think that's what he's tried to do with this incursion into Ukraine, is see some foreign policy success if he hasn't had that domestic success. So why now? Again, I think it is because of the dip in Putin's popularity. It is because of the westward-looking trajectory of Ukrainian politicians and Putin's nerves of Ukraine looking westward. The reason I think Ukraine is especially significant for Putin is because its history, more than, say, Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, which were part of the Soviet Union as well, Ukraine's history is very much intertwined with Russia's. Slavic, East Slavic country, Orthodox country, Cyrillic script, and a very closely related language there. That's not something either Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, for instance, have in common with Russia. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, influenced by Catholicism and Protestantism, have languages totally unrelated to Russian, use the Latin script, and have some histories that, you know, Russia is involved, but that Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia have some historical ties to the West. Ukraine's history, Ukraine's ties are to Russia. So if Ukraine goes west, if Ukraine moves into, hypothetically, NATO or the EU there, that's more symbolically significant than Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania having done that, because Ukraine is part of that same Orthodox, Slavic, Cyrillic world that Russia is, and has that intertwined history there. So Ukraine's leaving and potentially becoming capitalist and democratic. And it should be noted that Ukraine's position up to this point with capitalism and democracy has been kind of shaky there. It's not a perfect democracy or capitalist society by any means. But if it were to go in that direction, become truly free and democratic and capitalist, what is that going to mean for Russia's legacy, its history, and its own future then? Would that mean that the unique parts of the Russo world are not so unique, not so important in the end, and that the West is in the right, and that democracy and capitalism are the way to go, and that it's inevitable for Russia? Putin doesn't want to say that. Putin doesn't want to admit that. Putin, if he's taking a stance in the 19th century battle between the Slavophiles and the Westernizers, he is not a Westernizer. He does not want Russia to become like the West. He's still holding on to Russia as its own thing, and can have its own force and play its own role in the world. That is why I think he's trying to hold on so hard to Ukraine in particular there, because of the threat that losing Ukraine would mean to Russian identity and potentially to his own power there. If Ukraine goes, then what's to stop Russia from developing along the same lines there? People in Russia might be inspired to change the same way. So that's not a justification of Putin's actions, of course. That's not a trying to say he's morally in the right. Certainly, that's me trying to make sense of historically why is this question about Russia so significant? Because it hasn't been settled among Russians themselves. They don't know what Russia ought to be. They don't know what Russia's place in the world should be. That's an unsettled question, and it has been now since the early 1700s here. So I think this really is a debate that is still being played out here. And I'll stop there because that's about my 45 minutes. So I'll go to questions here.
Feel free to jump in with questions if you've got some.
I see one in the chat on the educated and wealthy people. Were they more on the Westernizer side compared to the poorer Slavophiles? No, not necessarily there. So there were Russian nobles, some of whom were willing to look past their own economic positions and situation and status and say, we should reform even if that's going to weaken the nobility and our own position as nobles. There were some nobles who were of the Slavophile bent, who wanted to, hold on to the system that existed in 19th century Russia, where there was a place for nobility in society and a place for the peasantry, and hold on to traditional ways of life there. So it wasn't necessarily an educated versus uneducated or wealthy versus poor split. It was a division within wealthy, educated society, kind of a mix within that small segment of society. Some wealthy people were of a pro-Western bent, some were of a pro-Russian bent.
If I may ask, what's the state of Russian literature now? And is it as tamped down as it was during the Russian Revolution?
There is censorship of literature, certainly. Is it tamped down as much as it was during the Soviet period or even the Tsarist period? No. There is censorship. There is likewise there's propaganda. So that's two sides of the same coin there. The blocking of information coming in by the regime and the spreading of the regime's own point of view. So censorship and propaganda are not the same thing. They're both being used in tandem by Putin and his regime. So yes, there is certainly some censorship. It's not to the extent that the Soviets had it, though. No.
And do the people who are keeping Mr. Putin in power, do they have to be satisfied?
Yes.
The oligarchs. And do you think the Crimea and Ukraine, do you think those are part of the price they want from Mr. Putin?
Yes. So this is something noteworthy about Putin's presidency in contrast to Yeltsin. So Yeltsin had his own oligarchs, that is, people who became very, very wealthy in the transition phase away from communism. So very, very strong businessmen who owned massive amounts of wealth. Putin censured and made examples of the very wealthy oligarchs who gained status and gained wealth during Yeltsin's years. Putin made it publicly known that he was stripping some of these oligarchs of their power and their wealth. But what Putin did is he enriched his own oligarchs. He made his own inner core very, very wealthy. And his oligarchs, his wealthy people, in contrast to Yeltsin's, by and large have a similar background to him. So a history in either the security forces of the Soviet Union or the army there. So that's the sort of person that Putin wanted to prop up and did prop up. What does Putin get from being surrounded by an inner circle of men that he's made wealthy who have a background in either the KGB like himself or the Russian military? Well, he's got people who are willing to do KGB-like things or military-like things to protect him there. So these are people who are knowledgeable about ways to use either force of some sort or more clandestine efforts that aren't force necessarily, but blackmailing and spying and those sorts of tactics to get rid of potential rivals to Putin. So these are the sorts of people that Putin has enriched. And yes, is there a price he has to pay to keep them on his side? Yeah, keeping them wealthy, keeping them happy. Does that include things like taking the breadbasket of Europe there? Yeah, that certainly doesn't hurt there if he succeeds in taking that there. That would be another arrow in his quiver there to keep the oligarchs happy there. That's another source of potential wealth for his cronies there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Couple in the chat, couple questions in the chat. Sally asks, Putin is from St. Petersburg. How has that affected his growth into his position today?
I don't know that the background in Petersburg necessarily impacts Putin's position here and Putin's role and Putin's initiatives here, because what's changed is once the Soviets came to power, they moved the capital of Russia back away from Petersburg to Moscow. So Petersburg during the Soviet period didn't have that same status that it had during the imperial days. And so Moscow took on that role as being the more important Russian city. And Petersburg also didn't any longer in the Soviet period have that same Western bent or that same window on the West that the Tsars intended for it to have. It wasn't a place where there was open communication with Western Europe and a place of the spread of Western ideas and Western trade, because the Soviet system was so shut off and closed and opposed to the West there. So Putin's being from Petersburg, he could have been from anywhere in Russia there, because the Soviet experience was totally different from what the imperial experience had been. Petersburg in Soviet time just doesn't have that same role as being the Western city of Russia there. It's a Soviet city, and that's what Putin grew up in, and then that's what he comes to adulthood in, and that's the experience he has. So I'd say Petersburg isn't really deeply affecting his thoughts there. Do the citizens of Russia face political censorship, or are there other forms of censorship that they face as well? Well, there are forms of censorship. So there is the blocking of information. There is the blocking of political ideas. There is the spread of ideas through propaganda. There is jailing of dissidents. That's a tool that Putin has. But Putin has also, he's commonly portrayed in the media, and so in news or newspapers as solely a thug, relying on brute force and military might and violent tactics. That's what gets into the news. And of course, current events, he is demonstrating that brute force and the willingness to engage in bloodshed there. That hasn't been the only arrow in his quiver that he's used there to block out potential dissidents or rivals to his regime. So one of the things that Putin has done is he has studied very carefully what's gone on in neighboring countries, because there were strong men like him in neighboring countries in Central Asia. So we're talking about the Stan countries there. So Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. And the fate of the strong men in these countries hasn't been the same as Putin's. Putin has been able to hold on to power more so than strong men in other countries here. And one of the things that he's learned is what not to do, what to avoid from what his neighbors have done. If his goal is to hold on to power, what does he do? And so he has taken some measures that are not just these brute force type of measures here. So for instance, Russia is, in theory anyway, a federation like the United States, meaning the United States, we have the national government, and a lot of lawmaking power is in DC. So Congress passing laws, the president signing them, and those laws applying to the US as a whole. But there's also a role for states to play. So Ohio has its own unique laws on some things. Out here in Arizona, we're doing some things differently. California has its laws, its tax policy. New York does its thing. Illinois does its things. There's a role for states or regions. In theory, Russia is like that as well, where there's the national government, and then there are the regions in Russia. But Putin has stripped away the power of those regional governments, and he's also made it such that the governors of those regions are appointed rather than elected. That's just another way of blocking out potential rivals for power there. They don't even have a chance to come through the normal political circuit there. Who is going to hold power in one of these regions? Pretty much someone who is from the major party, United Russia, that supports Putin. It's very hard for an independent voice to gain power in regional or local government in Russia. And if they're not emerging in the regional or local races, there's not some other platform for them to speak out and develop a following there. So Putin is able also to maintain his popularity in part because there's no clear opposition there. Their opposition voices don't find an outlet to make their voices heard. It's not in the Russian Duma, the national legislature, and it's not in the local regions there. So it's not just army and military matters. It's things like weakening the federalism of Russia. It's things like changing the electoral laws of Russia to make it hard for parties that aren't United Russia to win elections. These are all things that Putin is doing and has done in recent years to shore up his position and to block out potential rivals. So again, not saying that's the right thing to do, not saying it's a moral thing to do, saying if his goal is to maintain power, it might be a smart thing to do from Putin's point of view there. It is a way of keeping rivals at bay there. What stipulations or compromise? Do you see any path forward to Putin to extract himself from the war on Ukraine, or will he face shame and embarrassment if Ukraine defeats the Russian army? It would be hard to extract himself without some sort of gain there. And I think he's willing to go forward and push forward until he gets something. So these recent, fake votes that have happened here in the eastern regions, the sham votes on whether these populations here want to join Russia. If he gets part of Ukraine, that might be a satisfactory outcome there. He wants something there, but I don't think he can just remain in power having achieved nothing there. Again, because he hasn't delivered something great domestically. The economy of Russia is, considering the resources that Russia has, considering the vast landmass that Russia has, considering the mineral wealth that Russia has and the natural gas and the oil, ordinary citizens aren't feeling that wealth the same way we might expect them to. And if he's not delivering on the economic front, there's got to be some foreign policy win that stokes a pride in ordinary Russians, some victory of some sort that he can say, this is what we Russians are capable of achieving. So if he doesn't get that, if he doesn't have a win, I don't see how he maintains power there. He keeps trying to do the things that he's doing, again, block out rivals, through the rigged elections there, but that won't keep him popular there. So if Ukraine is to pull out the win here, that's very bad for Putin there. What stipulations or compromises do you see the rest of the world having to make for Putin to surrender? It ties into the previous question there. So what would it take for Putin to surrender here? So first, I would say I'd backtrack here. I'd say Putin is probably surprised by the resilience and the unity that Europe in particular has shown. There was no reason, there was nothing in EU history to suggest such unity there. And by no reason to suggest such unity, if we think of all the fissions and fractures that have gone on in the EU and the debates there. I mean, on foreign policy, for instance, the war in Iraq being one notable foreign policy thing. You had some EU member states that supported the US in Iraq, and you had some very big, notable countries that are part of the EU that wanted nothing to do with the war in Iraq. And so the EU not speaking with a common voice on that matter. There have been other foreign policy things where the EU has just not been unified and coherent with respect to a policy and position on foreign matters. But when it came to this situation, the EU was fast, deliberate, and took concrete steps in the form of sanctions there, and has held up that end pretty well and has remained fairly united here. I think that probably caught Putin off guard. I think he was expecting an easier war and less opposition here. That said, I think in the recent steps with the mobilization of new conscripts here suggests he's willing to wade this out and do a long winter war here. What sort of concessions or compromises could the world make to get Putin to surrender? I can't say. Again, I think it would have to be something fairly significant there. A concession of part of Ukraine, really, I think is what he wants. And whether the West is willing to do that, that seems like a big ask to say, we support Ukraine, but yes, have a part of it. That doesn't seem like the position that the West is going to take. So I think Putin is going to keep slogging along here. I don't know what else the West can offer that would satisfy him. I don't know what Ukraine could offer him. I don't think a commitment not to join NATO or not to join the EU is going to be enough. That's not a big enough win. There's nothing showy about that. There's nothing concrete about that. That's a promise made. Those are words. That's different from territory. That's different from resources. That's different from something tangible. And I think Putin wants something tangible. And again, morally, politically, what Ukraine and what the West are willing to give him. I mean, how much do you accommodate a dictator? How much do you accommodate an autocratic leader there? It's a really tricky situation there. It appears that modern Russia is a clientele state with the oligarchs as the clientele. Would it be they then who would replace Mr. Putin, or would it be the military? So I'd say they, that clientele, the oligarchs and the military are pretty much in the same orbit there. I wouldn't say they're at opposing forces there. Again, the oligarchs that Putin has made in contrast to the Yeltsin era oligarchs are military men or KGB men. These are the people that Putin has elevated here, and that includes, that one of the generals who is frequently in the news, leading the current efforts of the Russian military. He's wealthy himself, so it's not an either them or the other replacing Putin. That's the same inner circle there that we're talking about there. So the question of who replaces Putin, it would be likely a wealthy oligarch with military ties. That's who we're looking at there. If it became such that dissatisfaction with Putin's leadership became such that this inner circle is no longer willing to tolerate his rule, or feels that he's no longer equipped to handle the position of presidency, they could very well step in.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question.
We have time for a couple more questions, if anyone has them. I just have one, and this may be showing my ignorance of the region. Does Russia need the Ukraine to feed itself, or are they?
No.
And could any of this be motivated just from internal things that we might not be aware of, political moves, like for a region to break off from Russia, that he's trying to just hold it all together by doing this, or is there anything?
I think he has a pretty good control of the Russian regions themselves, and has kind of co-opted the leaders of the various regions of Russia. So for instance, in the past, Chechnya was in the news, and Chechnya was a trouble spot for Russia, and Chechnya was a breakaway region. But Putin has placated Chechen demands, and has kind of one of his own people allied with him at the moment there. other regions, it would be hard to see them breaking away there or having any real chance to do so. Some of the more diverse regions of Russia, and again, Russia is, maybe 70-ish, 75%-ish ethnic Russians and Russian speakers, but we've also got a lot of diversity in Russia proper, including some Turkic-speaking populations and some Asiatic groups there as well. But some of those regions where Russian speakers or ethnic Russians are not the majority, those are landlocked regions there. So it's hard to imagine them breaking away when they're surrounded on, all sides by Russia there. So I don't think it's a fear of the disintegration of Russia proper, so much as the fear, again, of spiritual Russia, the Orthodox Eastern Slavic Cyrillic world there. I think Ukraine is vital to that conception of Russian history and what Russia's role in the world is, again, in a way that's different from Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia having joined the EU or NATO. That's different. They're not integral to Russian history the same way Ukraine is. It was Kievan Rus before Moscow. It was so. To lose that from the sphere of orbit there, symbolically that means a lot for Russia and generally and for Putin as well.
Looks like we have one more question. Do you want me to read it or do you...
Go for it, Wendy.
Okay, let's see. The West hypothetically has the power to overrule Ukraine. This would, of course, come with a lot of international backlash from Western citizens. Is it plausible that the West decides to surrender some of Ukraine's territory, possibly without Ukraine's permission, in order to quell the conflict and form a resolution to the war by satisfying Putin's demands? Or would the West continue to offer aid to the humanitarian issues arising in Ukraine, even at great expense to themselves?
So what is plausible, I think, is not official recognition of Putin's takeover of part of Russia. I think what's plausible is a repeat of what happened in 2014, which is not official recognition of Putin's having taken Crimea. You don't see Western maps putting Crimea as part of Russia. You don't see Western politicians calling Crimea Russian, but de facto letting it be. I think that's the most the West is willing to do, is allow some sort of stalemate there where de facto Putin and Russians are running part of Ukraine, but not politically, not according to the standards of international law, not sanctioning or endorsing Putin's takeover of the other regions of Ukraine there, but letting it happen. I don't know that the West wants to get mired in a war with a nuclear power there. So it might be, again, a repeat of 2014 there, where de facto Putin has control over parts of Ukraine, but the West recognizing it, I would say no, that's probably not what's going on there. That's not going to happen there. I don't think there would be that veto of Ukraine's intentions or wishes there, especially given how much the West has already contributed to the cause and how much a show of support the US and the EU have devoted to the Ukrainian cause.
All right, well, I think we have asked Dr. Slaboch to talk a lot for the last 70 minutes. So I'm going to say going once, going twice on the questions. Third time. thank you very much for this. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone else has learned a lot. Seth, do you have a question? Or are you waving goodbye? Oh, you're clapping.
Thanks,
Oh,
Seth.
okay.
Appreciate that,
Yeah,
Seth.
yes. Sorry, I can't see the little tiny icon. I don't have my glasses. So yes, thank you very much, Dr. Slaboch.
Thank you.
If somebody has a question, is it okay for me to pass it along to you? So,
Absolutely, yes. Feel free to email me, ask me anything. If you want a private Zoom session, I'm happy to do that. So yeah, more than happy. Should I put my email in the chat? I can do that.
Sure, if you'd like to share it.
That is my email there. Nope, I gave a direct message. I want everyone in meeting. I can do technology. There you go. So yeah, happy to talk more with anyone who wants to, and it doesn't have to be on the themes of this talk. It can be anything related to Russia, Eastern Europe, or the EU. So there's a lot going on in the region. So.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. We hope you have a good night, and we hope the Mr. Hopping students that showed up, you have a lot to talk about tomorrow in class. So.
Thanks, everyone.